Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the second part of the 2017 PSVR retrospectives. This covers the second 2 quarters of the year, covering everything from July to December. There were 10 games released physically worth knowing about. Let's get right to it. First up this year is Paranormal Activity: The Lost Soul. This is a video game spin-off of the Paranormal Activity series that has the player exploring a house that's for sale where the family is haunted by a spirit. Moving through the house, you get information about the family, meet the girl who's crawling through the vents, and try to get out safely. Unfortunately, the game has very little to do with the franchise and doesn't really tie into any of the films at all. It also feels a lot more gamey, and there's some missed opportunities where it could have tried to feel more like the movies. Despite that, it has a good atmosphere for the genre, and has some pretty good scares. The game has 2 endings and some randomized features, so that you can still get surprised on multiple playthroughs. A patch came out that improved the turning and added strafing, which makes the movement much better overall. It's a decent horror experience in VR. It is a bit buggy and not much longer than a movie. It also has some of my gaming horror pet peeves, with annoying triggers for advancing and not letting you interact with things you should be able to. If you can look past that stuff though, it is worth checking out. A pretty similar title on paper after that, Don't Knock Twice. Apparently based on an urban legend, this horror game is based on the 2016 UK horror film also called Don't Knock Twice. The game has the player exploring a mansion, trying to save her daughter. The mansion is said to be haunted by a witch, and the story is pretty similar to the film, but apparently maybe not quite as clear what's going on in it. The VR gameplay lets the player teleport around, investigating the rooms, looking for items that'll help you progress. The game can be played with or without VR. The VR mode can be played with the Move controller or the standard controller, and like Paranormal Activity, it's a bit buggy, and it's even shorter. But if you're a fan of horror games, it might be worth a look. Next up is Radial-G Racing Revolved. This is a futuristic racing game that can be played in VR. It features 7 vehicles, 5 weapons, and 9 different tracks. The racing is pretty interesting in that the tracks are made up of tubes that you can move around as you go down them. There's also weapon pickups that you can use to take out other racers. The tracks include green boost gates and red gates that slow you down. An online mode allowed for 16 player races. All in all, definitely Wipeout inspired, but a very cool racing game that's probably worth checking out. Another racing game after that, VR Karts. This is a kart racer with a championship mode, time trials, and online play. The game features a number of different environments for the tracks, and weapons that can be aimed with head tracking in order to hit your opponents. The online play has races for up to 6 players, and DLC adds in racer customization. Then we get The Invisible Hours. An interesting take on the interactive movie genre, where you watch an ongoing movie and move around the areas to discover new clues about what's going on. It's kind of reminiscent of Night Trap in that way. The game takes place in a mansion where guests have been invited by Nikola Tesla, only to find him dead in the entryway. As the 7 suspects move around the home, you can move around to hear their conversations and see their actions. The game lets you pause, fast forward, and rewind the action so you can speed things up or review something or move to a different location. Since many events are happening at the same time throughout the game, you'll definitely want to be in multiple places at once to see all that. The cast is pretty fleshed out and have some interesting backstories and side plots worth checking out. You can also grab and examine objects in the environment to try and get more information about the game world. Overall, it's a fun take on the adventure genre and an interesting way to handle a murder mystery in gaming. The original release was VR only, but a patch added non-VR support. The game was also released on other platforms later. Then we get Touhou Kobuto 5 Burst Battle. Now this is a spin-off of the Bullet Hell shooter series. But it's more of like an arcade-style arena fighter, like Virtual On. The game stars 9 Touhou characters, with their own melee attacks and spells. Gameplay is one-on-one battles that can be played in a single-player story mode or versus another player or the CPU. The VR mode allows you to watch over the action as you play, but the viewing angle is a bit weird. The game itself isn't really that well regarded, and the VR mode doesn't seem to add too much to it, so unless you're a big Touhou fan who already enjoys the game, it's probably not worth going out of your way for. Third racer of the video after that, Gran Turismo Sport. With added VR support, a new physical release came out that includes that content. But given that the original game required an always-on internet connection to access most content, and to even save your game, I couldn't find an answer about if this VR content was playable offline. That's not a problem for most players, but since this video's focus on physical releases, it's worth knowing. As far as the VR goes, it's quite a bit scaled back from the full game. You can't play the main campaign mode or online races, but it's still considered one of the better VR racing integrations so far. The VR Tour mode includes several options. You can drive most of the cars and tracks in VR, but given that a big part of Gran Turismo has been how much effort they put into modeling the interiors of the cars, the VR perspectives makes for an interesting way to check that out. The drive option lets you race one-on-one through most of the tracks, though only in specific configurations. Unfortunately, this is the only racing mode available in VR, and you're only ever racing one other car at a time. The time trial option is just what you'd expect, and the VR showroom mode lets you move around the cars and check them out. This is worth checking out if you're already a Gran Turismo fan, or if you just want a chill driving game in VR. Sticking with that theme, next is ATV Drifts and Tricks. Now this is from the developers of Motor Racer 4, which we talked about in our last video. The VR modes here sound exactly like that game. Apparently rough visuals with just some hot laps and time trial modes available in VR. And you still have to unlock those courses in the normal game in order to play them in VR. Really the only difference here is that you're riding ATVs instead of bikes. A definitive edition of this game was also released physically in 2018, though I can't find any information about exactly what's different on it. A huge release after that, the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim VR. Now this is a separate release that adds VR support to one of the most popular Western RPGs of all time. I can't say if the amount of changes needed for VR really required a separate release versus just DLC of the original game, but given how spotty Bethesda's engine is, I wouldn't be surprised if it was just much easier to manage. And at least for physical collectors, they can get the VR game on disc. By most accounts, the VR integration is pretty good, with most of the actions being intuitive and working well with the existing gameplay. Blocking, melee or ranged combat, and casting spells require motions which better represent the actions you're trying to do. Experiencing the world through VR gives a better sense of scale and awe to the already inspiring game world. There are a couple options for movement, including teleporting and smooth movement that can be set to match what best suits your VR experience and needs. That said, this is an RPG that players have spent hundreds of hours in, and that's not a length of time I really want to spend in any VR game. Which is another knock against a separate release, since you can't switch back and forth out of VR as wanted. Outside of all the VR changes, the game is pretty similar to the previous release. The full story is there, and it's got all the expansions as well. Last up for this year is Doom VFR. Titled as a nod to the BFG, Doom VFR is an original game that's a prequel to the Doom reboot that came out the year before. The game is built from the ground up for VR, allowing for the fast-paced combat of Doom, along with concessions to keep the gameplay comfortable in VR. The game takes place shortly after demons take over the research base on Mars, and has you in control of a doctor who's killed in the attack, but who's had their consciousness transferred to a system where you can move into a battle chassis and take on the demons in order to restore the facility. Default movement lets you aim around and jump to anywhere to change your position. You can also do quick dashes and turn in segments, but in the settings you can change it for free movement. Although with the pace of the game, you have to be pretty used to VR, or else you're liable to get motion sickness pretty easily. The gameplay takes a lot from the last Doom game and features a ton of weapons, grenades, weapon and character upgrades, and a neat take on gory kills. When an enemy is staggered from attacks, you can teleport into them to do a kill, and it's really satisfying to chain those together. You can play the game with the standard controller, move controllers, or the aim controller. Overall, it's a pretty impressive take on bringing a Doom game to VR, and worth checking out if you can stomach it. So yeah, thanks for checking out this retrospective. Hope you found some games that are worth checking out. Like, subscribe, share, and all that, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
It's appreciation time. Reward Mike's hard work by subscribing. Otherwise, we might see you in the next class trial.